The federal government is cracking down on social media use for kids and is expected to table the legislation to do so as soon as tomorrow. Now, the Globe and Mail first reported this week that the bill will propose a ban on social media for children under the age of 16. The CBC's Karina Roman joins me now with more on this. So, Karina, what more do we know about this coming legislation? Because we're all trying to pull threads together these last few days.
Yeah, cobbling threads together, yes. So there is a technical briefing tomorrow for journalists for what they're calling the Safe Social Media Act. And the goal in this notice of this technical briefing is to make social media services and AI chatbots safer for children. And CBC News has confirmed some of what the Globe and Mail was first reporting, including that there will be some kind of social media ban or restrictions. It might not be what people perceive to be a ban, but restrictions for children under 16. There'll be a new digital regulator that will establish safety standards. And it's understood that if companies can meet those standards, there may be a mechanism for them to return to having young Canadians back on their platform. So, as I said, maybe not an outright ban, but more sort of some kind of incentivization structure.
An exemptions framework, where if you meet certain standards, you can open it back up.
Exactly. So that's what we're hearing. In regards to chatbots, we know they too will be regulated. There is this concern about chatbots for people who aren't necessarily that familiar with them, that they can be like companions, but to vulnerable kids, they can coach them into very unhealthy behaviors, whether we're talking suicide or disordered eating. So that's sort of one of the main concerns. The regulations, though, would not be as sweeping for the chatbots as they would for the social media platforms. But really, the focus would be a duty to protect children. There might probably be measures on age verification. And of course, lots of people will be thinking, well, what would this do? How would this address what happened with Tumbler Ridge and the tragic shooting there and the role that OpenAI's chatbot played in that? So we do expect a reporting mechanism perhaps to deal with issues like that, where red flags went they didn't go unnoticed, they went unreported.
Yes. So the shooter in the Tumbler Ridge tragedy was looking at things in an AI chatbot and asking questions that OpenAI saw. Knew it was maybe trouble, but then did not report it to the government. So that's obviously something that needs to be dealt with. So look, 4 straight Liberal election wins. I think this is the 4th crack at an online arms bill, right? It has not been smooth sailing here. I mean, what are the challenges with this type of legislation? Because it's always led to a pretty partisan response.
It's pretty fraught. The original bills, the predecessors to this one, mostly brought during the Trudeau governments, was seen as too sweeping. It had elements from all over sort of shoved into one bill, everything from hate speech to Human Rights Act amendments. And critics were also very vocal about feeling that it was about curtailing free speech. So the government obviously looking to try and avoid that level of controversy or pushback, saying they're trying to learn from their past mistakes. The Justice Minister, however, says there is a way to balance safety and freedom the way he's looking at it. Have a listen.
Tell you, when you're meeting with the parents who are dealing with the child who's been bullied, not only in the schoolyard, but when they come home at night, it doesn't feel particularly free for that kid living their life day to day. These principles are not at odds. They are complementary in my view.
The other big challenge, David, is the how. How do you force tech giants to comply? How can you enforce it effectively? Something that's proven to be very difficult in Australia, which was the first country to do this. I guess there's some hope that it might become easier if other G7 countries, which we're hearing talk about, jump on this bandwagon as well. There's strength in numbers if more than a couple countries are doing it. And perhaps that strength in numbers might also stave off the potential for being another trade irritant with the U.S. That is another challenge that perhaps wasn't a challenge that Trudeau faced with his online harms bills, but that could be something that also causes some sticky moments for this government. Yeah, certainly there is a lot of talk in a lot of Western allies about dealing with this. And of course, the big difference this time, Carney's got a majority government. So that makes it a little bit easier on at least getting it through the House. All right, Karina, thank you so much. That's the CBC's Karina Roman here in the studio. Well, among those who have penned letters to the Prime Minister in support of banning social media for those under 16, the Canadian Medical Association, as well as the Premier of New Brunswick. However, few specific details are known so far about the comprehensive digital safety bill.
Out of respect for my colleagues, I can't comment more on it, but I think it's suffice to say that we will take all reasonable measures to make sure kids are safe in this country.
Do you feel more confident?
I think it's obvious why it's a priority. Kids are dying.
Amanda Third is a professor at Western Sydney University and a digital rights advisor for the United Nations. Amanda Third, it's good to meet you. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, David.
So the data suggests that still, about 3/4 of Australian teenagers are getting around this under 16 social media ban. So do policy makers underestimate the digital adaptability of this generation, its determination to be online?
Well, look, certainly circumvention has been a major challenge for the implementation of the new legislation in Australia, and I think one that we didn't entirely anticipate. But, you know, what I think needs to be understood is that it is a staged implementation. So far, platforms have only been asked to remove those users who declared themselves as underage at sign-up. The next phase, which is due for completion at the end of this month, is to use age inference technologies to try to anticipate who is likely to be an underage user and to require platforms to remove those users. That's got obvious privacy implications, but circumvention has certainly remained a key challenge for us.
So age inference technology, just for people not completely immersed in this space, this is when AI looks at an image of you and guesses your age, and if you're not obviously over 16, like I would be, for example, you're not allowed to log on. Is that how it
That's right.
works?
Well, it doesn't only look at your facial features, but it will look at the patterns of usage, so who you're connected with, the kinds of content you're sharing, when you signed up, because of course a lot of children who were removed in the first phase have now signed up again to the platform. So, so it's about having the technology corroborate facts about you in order to identify who you are. And that, as I say, it's got obvious privacy implications.
Right, so even though a majority of people are still using it, is it too early to say it doesn't work? Because I know you've called this a failure of imagination, this ban. I mean, how do we assess where it is?
Yeah, so look, we don't have evidence either way as to whether or not bans work, and we need to wait for the results of the eSafety Commissioner's 2-year longitudinal study, which will deliver some results iteratively, so we'll have some guidance in the not too distant future. So it's too early to call it in a sense, but I think there have been some major concerns with the way that the legislation has been implemented, the way that the legislation has kind of pulled together. There seem to be some major flaws. So for example, the legislation prohibits underage users from having a social media account. But of course, social media accounts are one of the key ways that platforms target safety features at children and young people. And so arguably what the legislation has in fact done is removed a key layer of protection by prohibiting social media accounts. So you can see how the challenge is really, can this legislation meet its objectives? Can it achieve the outcomes that we want it to?
Help me just understand that safety bit, because how is the absence of youth on these platforms, how does that compromise the safety targeting that you're outlining? Help me understand exactly how you get from A to B on that.
Well, simply, like, children can still come online and watch social media content without a social media account. So when you remove that social media account, it's...
There's no way to put up the firewall between the young kid and the content you may want to screen them from.
That's
okay, I got you there. So how does this need to be improved? And I take your point on you need the longitudinal study, even if the current generation is finding ways to get around it. 8, 9, 10-year-olds that may not have accounts, when they age into this area, they will not have had it. They will not necessarily be skirting it, right? So it could increase over time. What are the things that need to be looked at now to ensure that this is robust and works in all the ways the regulators want it to work?
Yeah. So I think the key question is whether or not a ban can actually hold technology platforms accountable for the well-being of children online. And, you know, I think by evicting children from social media, you actually place less of an onus on platforms to design for children. And what that means is that when children come online at age 16, potentially they're going to be stepping into much worse spaces than they already encounter. So I think what I would encourage the Canadian government to look at doing is keeping children in those spaces and demanding more of our platforms, actually calling them to account for designing out those features that are known from the evidence base to be more harmful for children, and to really incentivizing them to rethink their business model and to center children's rights, needs and aspirations, not just in the design of products, but also in core business decision making.
Right, if you make it a purely adult space, it becomes a purely adult space.
100%.
And so then you walk into something you are not prepared
Correct.
for.
And arguably, David, it'll become worse for adults too, right?
Yes.
So children have a kind of modifying effect. Their presence in these spaces helps to keep them safer for everybody.
So how do you then incentivize them and regulate them on the compliance side, right? Because I know I've talked to some young people about this who are doing work with McGill University about artificial intelligence and social media as the Gen Z generation, the most exposed generation to it. They talk about design of like the autoplay video, the endless scroll, the way the algorithms just sort of jolt you to give you a dopamine hit to keep you going. And these are all things that, I've got young boys. You don't want them doing this all the time. Go outside and play, right? But there is, like, they pay for engagement. They want,
100%.
The content creators, are incentivized to be outrageous and addictive in what they do. So how do you regulate that compliance when it seems to go against the core of the business model?
Well, this is the precise question that needs to be answered. And actually, I don't think it's as hard as it might sound, David. I think, for example, if you identify those features, some of which you've just identified, that are more harmful to children at particular thresholds, you can design regulation that says that platforms are not allowed to expose children to those particular features. And if you design a regulatory ecosystem around that principle, what you do is you move companies out of compliance mode, right? Out of let's tick the box that we've booted off those users we know are underage. You kind of move them into a mode where they're thinking about what's great for kids online, right? How do we compete with one another to design the best possible environments for children and young people to be growing and learning in?
But what is the carrot and stick in this, right? Because if you're going to regulate, it needs to be an incentive and also a consequence. And we have not yet seen the Canadian legislation on this, though the reporting that is getting out there is that it will be a ban that you can have lifted as a company if you adopt certain safety recommendations. Is that the kind of balance you're talking about in this?
Look, I think it's great that there's an exemptions framework. I mean, this is one of the limitations of the Australian legislation is we don't have an exemptions framework, and I think that has really limited the scope of the legislation. So it's really pleasing to see that the Canadian government is looking at that. But my question back to the government would be, why do we need to ban if we're also going to have these exemptions? Why wouldn't you just put those conditions into a regulation and require platforms to design from them? That way you get the benefits for children and young people. You orient the industry to designing those optimal opportunities for children online, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because of course there are many benefits for children to accessing social media for their health, their education, and a range of other things.
But one of the challenges is that with a lot of the tech companies, as the Canadian government in various iterations, whether it's online news, similar to what Australia did, taxation, there's pushback, it becomes a trade issue, it becomes an irritant. The government of the United States and all of the industry associations are brought to bear to put their weight on the Canadian government. So how do you just bring in regulations that they could balk at, because they're mostly companies based outside of Canada, and just refuse to comply with and call their congressman, their senator, or their president?
Look, I think you're raising a really legitimate concern, but the fact is that that I think the companies would respond really well to this, because what they're looking for is a level playing field, which would create the competitive conditions to encourage them to deliver on their obligations to children and young people. I don't think actually you'd be met with major resistance, at least not from the people on the ground who do the work. Right? You might get some grandstanding, but I think the key here is really that there's an opportunity here for Canada to do something that is truly globally leading. I think, you know, the idea of a ban is incredibly seductive, and we've seen this kind of viral policy-making moment grasp nations around the world. You know, 42 countries are considering similar legislation or have just implemented it. But actually there's a really big space for alternatives, and arguably those alternatives will get us more quickly, more resource efficiently to the finish line of protecting children, but also supporting their positive digital engagement. And I think that if Canada could step in, develop a model, it would be truly world leading, and better if it could socialise that model with other countries across the world, encourage them to adopt similar regulatory interventions. We could begin to hold platforms to account at the scale at which they operate, right? So
which is global.
Yeah, so I think there's a big opportunity here for the government.
Amanda Third, professor at Western Sydney University. We appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David.
The federal government is expected to table legislation tomorrow, which could restrict young Canadians' access to social media.
As I said last week, with respect to AI specifically, the government will be taking steps to protect people's data, their privacy, and their children. So that is a focus of this government.
Our motivation is really to ensure that we're being responsible when it comes to protecting kids in particular.
Suffice to say that we will take all reasonable measures to make sure kids are safe in this country.
Do you feel more confident?
I think it's obvious why it's a priority. Kids are dying.
All right, the Globe and Mail first reported that the bill will propose a ban on social media for children under 16, adding that companies that meet certain safety standards may be able to allow kids to opt back in. We're going to start there with the Power Panel. We've got Emily Nicola, who is a columnist for Le Devoir. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a Conservative cabinet minister, and Nathan Cullen is former Conservative cabinet minister. What did I say? Did I? Was one. Okay, sorry. And Nathan Cullen is a former BC NDP MP and BC NDP minister. Sorry, I'm so tired from the GG special yesterday. I'm making mistakes all over the place. Supriya, I have a feeling you have a lot to say on this particular topic. So I'm going to start with you. You know, we're hearing it's a ban on social media under the age of 16 with some sort of an exemptions framework of some kind. And AI chatbots will be included with a duty to protect children, maybe some age verification, and obviously a reporting mechanism after what happened in Tumbler Ridge. What are your thoughts on what we're hearing here?
Look, I mean, I come at this as someone who's been immersed in the work of platform governance in some way or another since 2021, right? Including running policy for the Center of Media, Technology, and Democracy at McGill University that looked at these issues, and then being the point person in Prime Minister Trudeau's office when, you know, they tried to do the online harms bill the last time, which ended up dying on the order paper once Parliament was prorogued. Mm-hmm. So, look, I think movement on the file is a net positive, but I do think there's, you know, some reason for consternation based on what's been leaked so far. The Globe is reporting, to your point, that any social media ban for kids will be temporary in nature once the regulator gets set up and a platform can prove that it's, you know, not a tire fire for kids. Then the ban for that platform, you know, ostensibly lifts. That's good. And that's a good thing. But the issue is that, and I've mentioned this before, is that any age assurance scheme, and language matters here because age estimation and age verification aren't the same thing, is going to mean that adults are going to be subject to it as well. In order to determine who is underage, you have to card everyone who is of age. And, you know, then when we get into age verification versus age estimation, I mean, if we're talking the verification route, we're talking about like uploading government issued IDs. If you're going the estimation route, it'll be, sure, a facial scan most likely. So perhaps better cybersecurity for adults, but it tends to be pretty error prone. And it tends to use all sorts of other surveillance mechanisms to then better determine the age of the user. And then the other thing I would point out is that, you know, our own privacy laws in this country don't have any specific protection for kids' data. So unless, along with this, there's an amendment to PIPEDA, we're asking kids to hand over sensitive data and then not really offering them any protection. And if you look at the data from other jurisdictions, Australia is a really good example. Their own e-safety commissioner's first compliance report found that it was roughly like 70-ish% of children who that had accounts before the ban still had access to them after the ban. No discernible reduction in cyberbullying or in any image-based abuse complaints for those that were under the age of the ban. Kids continue to route through VPNs or through borrowed accounts. They're using false birthdays. So there's all sorts of issues. And while I think the bill has been a long time coming, I think we should be skeptical especially in light of the way this federal government has been responding to criticism of some of their other tech bills, like Bill C-22. So I remain optimistic. I wait to see what's in the bill, but I fear that we're like one step away from this government saying something similar to the Harper era Minister Vic Taves did when he said, you're either standing with us or with the child pornographers. And I would like the government to actually listen to, critics and experts like Michael Geist, who are pointing out some of the very big issues with some of their bills.
Yeah, and Lisa, because I promoted you back to cabinet in my introduction with my screw up there, I'm going to come to you on this. We spoke with Amanda Third earlier in the show, who is in Australia, and she's a researcher in this, and shares some of the same concerns Supriya outlined there, but says, need a 2-year longitudinal study, like the next generation of kids who aren't already on social media will see how it starts to progress. But Supriya gave a very good summary of all the challenges of legislating on this one, given the pervasiveness of the social media platforms and the power that they have.
It's a great case. And, we all know that legislation is a very broad kind of tool. It's not a surgical tool. It's something that you use in order to try to impact as much as you can across the board. So whether or not they're going to get it right on this go around, we're about to find out. I did my own little focus group, by the way. I asked my 2 sons, who are 25 and 22, about the concept of the social media ban. And interestingly enough, they thought 16 was too old. It should be 14. And that if it's 16 and under, you're catching people who are all lumped together in secondary school, and they're going to be put at a disadvantage to people who are over 16 in secondary school. So I think this is a case where the government is really not going to please everybody and may please a few, but it is something that has to be done. We are seeing too many things in society that don't seem to be working, and social media, they have all the power in the world to create those algorithms. I was listening to your interview talking about the dopamine hits on Instagram or on TikTok, and hey, I'm guilty of that. You can find yourself in a spiral of a scroll, and you wonder what happened to the last hour. I can only imagine what it does for brains that are just forming.
Yeah, my boys are 9 and 12, and I'm not asking them. They're just banned until they move out. Emily, which could be a while in this economy. Emily, one of the things that Amanda Third did say to me, though, is that if you take kids off these platforms, you remove the incentive, essentially, for the platforms to make them kid-friendly and kid-safe. And by making them adult-only spaces, they become adult-only spaces, and they could get a whole lot worse as a result of this. So this is a difficult calibration in legislation and in intention.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. First of all, we need to be very careful with any sort of public debate that starts with, this is for the well-being of children, because who wants to be against a measure that is sold because we want to protect children, right? So the emotional aspect of it makes it very fraught. The other thing is that as adults, I think we are very likely to point to the online harms that is done to children while being completely oblivious to the fact that we are ourselves addicted and this is harming us as well. And we think that because we're adults, we're not concerned, but the bullying that you're seeing for kids is also there for adults, and it has had a huge impact on polarization, online violence, and silencing more voices in public sphere that are coming from more marginalized identities, minorities, rights being under attack as well, and democracy becoming a dumpster fire, more generally speaking. So yes, you're right to point out that if we make it an issue about kids, then we are less likely to create incentive for platforms to stop the dumpster fire that they've created when it comes to adults as well, and the harm that it's doing to our brain. I also think that platforms are not likely to push back too hard against this, because at the end of the day, their business model is about ads and revenue, and kids underage don't have that much spending power. And so they're still making money out of the addiction of adults. but all of it makes it fraught. I think we need to look back at, tobacco or all sort of products that were put in the history of this country and the world that were highly poisonous. The effect of the poison can be worse on children because they're more vulnerable, because they're still growing. But there's still that question of why is it allowed to have a product out there that is poisonous? And we should stop the product from being poisonous in the first place. And that means legislating the algorithms, the aspect of the platforms that are harmful in general. And we should, I think, stop normalizing the fact that those platforms are harmful and stop, just trying to get the kids out of the harm.
Yeah.
But ask, why is it that a harmful product is taking so much of our time and attention in the first place? And we've done it with tobacco, we've done it with so many other things, but for social media, we obviously don't have, as an individual country sometimes, the governance power to be able to do it without being punished. And so here we are.
Yes, and Nathan, I take Emily's point that when people are shouting, won't somebody please think of the children? Sometimes, they're leading with that, but for different reasons. But there is a broad consensus that young people are exposed and vulnerable, and something needs to change. And this, I think, is going to be one of the things to talk about at the G7 when the Prime Minister goes on his trip there next week.
Well, the standard has been set by the minister when he said kids are dying, which is true. And if that's the argument being used for the legislation, then the seriousness of it and the effectiveness of it will be measured against that. If they're trying to keep kids from dying because of the impacts of the toxic social media environment that we've been allowed to create and enter their lives through the device in their hands, this is so much worse than smoking. This is so much worse than tobacco. It's much more effective at getting into our dopamine cycle. And the consequences, we're running an experiment on our kids right now. We don't know what the long-term, well, we know what the immediate effects have been since this all got mobile. Jonathan Haidt and others have done an excellent job in telling us what's happened with depression, self-harm rates, which have doubled amongst teenagers. They impact right across the spectrum. Kids do, I have 16-year-old boys, they listen to you, but they more watch what you do. And of course, we're all complicit in our own addictive cycles towards these things. And there is something different, though, of a 40 or 50-year-old who, as Lisa says, falls into the vortex or toilet bowl of a social media platform for an hour, feel a little bit worse about the world and what's going on, maybe, versus a 12-year-old who's being targeted with messages telling them they're incomplete, they're too fat, they're not living the life that they should be leading, because that brain is forming. So I take the minister at his word. Whether it's going to actually work or not is going to be very hard to tell. Australia is ahead of us, so we can learn from their mistakes. But Supriya's points were excellent. And if the government's treating this seriously, as in kids are dying, we need to protect them, then I anticipate that their enforcement and effectiveness of this legislation has to match that. And if they miss that mark, well, that's either by intention or incompetence. Either way, parents are not going to be happy 2 years down the road if things have just stayed the same or in fact gotten worse despite the legislation.
But Supriya, that is a tough mark to hit. I understand that Mark Miller saying that as sort of the motivation for this, but these aren't Canadian companies. They have enormous power and political influence and no end of resources at their disposal, right? And just the ability to get them to comply with it. The recent experience in the digital space suggests it's a difficult thing for a country like Canada to do with these big companies.
Sure, but right now, if you're a kid in the UK or in the EU or in Australia, your feed is better than it would be if you're a kid in Canada. Even individual states, right? So there are things we can be doing. It's not going to make it 100% of a safe space for every single kid or every single individual on these platforms. But I mean, it doesn't make any sense why we don't have an age appropriate design code that's embedded in. So if you're a minor, why do you have autoplay? Why do you have infinite scroll? Why can adults that aren't in your network DM you or add you to a, to their circle? Why, as a kid, Am I being, bombarded with ads for appetite suppressant lollipops? To Nathan's point, like, I'm a grown woman. It's not the best if I'm getting that, but my brain's fully formed and it's fine. I can make those judgments. I don't think a teen girl or a teen boy getting, creatine supplements targeted towards them or whatever the case may be is in the same position. So there are things we can be doing, and there are, accountability measures we can be demanding of the platforms. First and foremost would be a duty to act responsibly. All other consumer-facing products have to undergo that statutory duty. It makes no sense why social media companies up until this point have been exempt. But I worry that with some of the language coming from the government right now about this is about, think about the children and kids are dying. I don't discount any of that, of course, and I'm not trying to make light of a very serious situation. But I don't think that reverting to that as a key message while then having a blanket ban or a moratorium that will implicate adults in an age assurance scheme is the best way to do it, because it's just, you're basically lining up, again, the Vic Taves argument of, well, if you're against this, then you're with the bad people. And I think there's a lot of thoughtful criticism out there and a lot of very smart people that have been working on this for, a very long time that would suggest that exactly like, my co-panelists have said, we've seen what other jurisdictions have done. So if we know the data from Australia isn't the best, it makes no sense to me why we'd be continuing to go down this route.
Right. So Lisa, I just wonder, as a final point on this, about protecting children and look, the extreme arguments where that could potentially go. Do you think that's trying to create a binary to make it difficult to oppose and critique it, or is it because this is where the consensus is on the motivation to deal with this? That, I was talking to Kate Harrison about this yesterday. She said even with like libertarian conservative moms, they look at it and say, we got to start regulating this stuff because it's out of control. I don't know. What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of cringed when I heard the minister put it in as stark a term as he put it in. And definitely grabs your attention, doesn't it? I mean, that's kind of the shock and awe of it. Whether or not you're able to hit those marks, as everybody else said. I want to add on one piece, though. Emily pointed something out that I think is really important. Legislation is not just about enforcement. It's also about setting a societal norm, and it's sending a message to parents that the studies show that if you're under 16, you really should be careful about what you're doing on social media. I think as much of anything else, it's an education for parents out there and telling them, look, it's not cool. Have these conversations on hockey teams and on baseball teams and figure out a way for yourselves to make sure you're monitoring, because it's a bit of a lost space.
Yeah, and it's interesting as the government rolls out the AI strategy, we're going to have AI literacy, and it feels like there's a gap, right? Like this is an area, because as Emily, everyone said, it's bad for adults too, right? Our phones have the drinking water and the sewer water coming out of the same pipe, and that ain't good.